Hello, we're going to be talking about an altar of decision. Pastor Cliff talked this weekend about the altar of decision. And so we're going to look at that and as we look into Scripture, what the Scriptures are telling us about this. And I want to give you just a little bit of background. We're going to be talking about Jacob a lot. And as you recall, Jacob and Esau were twin brothers, born of Isaac. And Esau was the brother who had given his birthrights over to his brother Jacob for a bowl of stew, which may seem a little crazy, but maybe he was suffering from low blood sugar. I'm sure he probably wasn't, but think just for a moment of their relationship. So you have Esau, who later in life had founded Edom, and it became the enemy of Israel. Jacob had been the chosen one, and he would be the one who would lead Israel. And so these two people typified this age-long struggle between the people of God and their enemies. And we see this throughout Scripture, where God is leading his people and he's leading them into lands and areas where they have to endure and encounter enemies. And so thinking about that and putting that in the background of our minds as we start to look at this. So looking at the altar of decision, and as we make a decision, this decision making, what are the things, I was trying to put together, what are the things that we commonly think about as we make a decision? And usually it's things like this. Is this a good decision for me? Is this advantageous? Is this the right thing? Can this really happen? Can this come to fruition? Can I afford it? Do I have the time for it? Do I have the talent for it? Do I have the finances for it? So all of these things go into our decision making. And I will say this is our norm. This is how the world would see that we would be making good decisions, right? Using all of those thoughts and as we think about making decisions, running through all of those things. So that's kind of our normal way. So John 15:19 says, if you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. So let's look at this scripture, this one piece of scripture from, again, John 15, verse 19, where it is reminding us, Jesus is reminding the disciples, and he's reminding us that we're not of this world. And so as we go back to this decision-making thing, so many times we want to make our decisions in a worldly way. And so I have a couple things for us to think about. Why is that? And many times we worry about being accepted by those around us. We want to feel like we're accepted and part of something and doing the right thing. So when people know and we're around our friends and we're talking about making decisions, we don't want to be way out here with our decision making. We want to make decisions that other people would accept and say, hey, yeah, you're on the right path. Jesus tells us, as he did the disciples, that we were chosen. We are a chosen people not to be part of the world, but to be part of God's plan, part of God's world. So how does that play? I think we need to think about this. How does that play into our decision making? Many times when we choose God, we are rejected by those around us. And that's what Scripture is stating here in just this one little verse, that many times we will be hated by others. We'll feel like we're an outcast. We'll feel like people are making fun of us. And Jesus is saying that's okay. Don't be of the world. You're in the world, but don't be of the world. Don't make your decisions and don't make what you do all about being accepted through the worldly culture that we live in. And so I want to look at Genesis 28, 10 through 22, and then kind of go back over the last few weeks that Cliff talked to us about as far as these altars. So Genesis 28, starting at verse 10 says, Jacob left Beersheba and went out to Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are laying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I've promised. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head, and he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God be with me and will watch over me on this journey that I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. So let's unpack those verses a little bit and skip actually back Genesis 28:2, where we see it says that God is saying that Jacob needs to leave. He says, go at once, leave where you are at. Take a wife for yourself. And he tells Jacob where to go. And so as we think about what Pastor Cliff talked about, this altar of new beginnings, we see in chapter 2, verse 2, in chapter 28, verse 2, where Jacob is starting this new beginning. God is sending him out and says, I want you to leave this place where you are at. I have something new for you. And then we see in verse 13 and part of 15, where he's talking to Jacob through this dream, that he has this promise, this covenant that he's making to Jacob. I'm telling you, I'm going to send you out here, and this land I have promised to give to you and your descendants. And then we see in verse 15 and 16 that we see this altar of sovereignty, this altar of, God being with him always. And it says in 15 and 16, let's go back. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. You see, God is in control of all of this. So we see this altar of new beginnings, this altar of promise and covenant. We see this altar of sovereignty that God is placing into Jacob. And so I want you also to look at Matthew 10, 29 through 31, where we see that God talks about the sparrow. And he talks about how the sparrow, this tiny creature, how important that is to him. But he says, I know the number of hairs on your head. And so if I care so much for the sparrow, how much more could I care for you? And then in Colossians 1, 16 and 17, we see here that God is the greatest creator, making all things, not making some things, but making all things. And then as we go to Proverbs 16:33, we see that even as we throw dice and we think that it's by chance that these numbers come up, that in Proverbs 16:33 that it talks about that the throw of the dice is determined by God. There is nothing uncontrolled or by chance with God. He is that sovereign. And so as we come then this week to this altar of decision, we see that Jacob has to make a decision. Is he going to follow God's plan? Is Jacob going to trust the plans of God? And God gives him this nice little taste of what he has in store for him in a dream. My friends, sometimes God does the same thing for us and we miss it. He speaks to us. God speaks to us when we open up Scripture and when our hearts are open to hear from Him. He speaks through us. As we go to Him in prayer, God speaks to us and directs us. We have a multitude of Christian brothers and sisters that are around us that can feed us their wisdom, be praying for us. So as we make decisions, we need to think about all those things that we have that supported Jacob, that support us. We have a Father who has the plan, and we have to make the decision. Are we going to follow what the world would have us to follow? What seems normal, what seems right, so that we can be accepted and part of? Or are we really willing to say, God, whatever decision you want me to make, whatever path it is that you're taking me down, I trust you. I believe in you. And I want to follow your plan and your ways. So I have a few questions for you. Think for a minute about the parallel of the relationship between Jacob and Esau and the people of God and their enemies. How does this still exist? How do we see it played out currently? Reflect on how we make decisions. How do we ensure that we don't conform to the worldly ways? Give examples of worldly ways, values, and culture that is the norm, but actually conflicts with Christian ways and values. Again, read John 15:19 and dissect that verse sentence by sentence. Then look at Genesis 28:10 through 22, which we had already had read, and reread that and discuss how you see the various altars that Pastor Cliff has brought to us each week. How do you see those altars reflected throughout this passage? The new beginnings, the covenant, and sovereignty. What helped Jacob decide to follow God's plan? If you had such a vivid dream, what do you think your response would have been? And lastly, thinking about Jacob and Esau, we can see sin evident in both of their lives. As we look at Esau and Jacob and when they were younger, and they had sinful ways in their lives, just as we do, yet God worked through them both. Interpret that for your life, because God can work through you, and He asks you to make the decisions that He has for you.